Up first at my number 9 spot, or the worst of the legendary quests, unfortunately, I think it goes to Rogue with the Caverns Below.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Yeah, I said Quest Rogue was gonna suck, but where's it gonna land on my final rankings for the legendary quests from Journey to Unguro? All 9 of them are about to rotate out of standard format, which means we've had a full 2 years almost to see how impactful they've been in the game. So I went through and I thought I'd rank them from worst to best to see the most influential quests over the last 2 years. Up first here in last place, the worst quest, I have the Marsh Queen for Hunter. This is one people have been trying to make work forever. Every time a new 1-drop hits the game, people think, oh, Quest Hunter's finally going to work, and it just never does. And I think that really boils down to the fact that the reward for Marsh Queen just isn't worth it. Like, it's just not impactful enough, fast enough. It's not a big enough flip on the board or a swing state scenario. So even if you do achieve this easily and successfully, which you can do nowadays, there's just no payoff for it. So that's why the Marsh Queen has never found a home in any sort of competitive deck, and in my eyes is the most disappointing, the worst of all legendary quests. Up next at the number 8 spot here, we have a heartbreaker for me, Lakari Sacrifice. I've tried my very hardest, but this is another card which hasn't made it into a real competitive Hearthstone deck. This thing doesn't show up on tier list. Yes, you can win games. I've certainly won a lot with Lakari Sacrifice, you know, those sort of 45 to 48% win rate decks, but that's not what you need in Hearthstone to succeed. So it's another one where I think the reward is probably just not good enough. 3/2s aren't all that impactful, and even though they're guaranteed long-term thanks to the portal from Lakari Sacrifice, you often have to give up a little bit too much on the way. So between a mediocre reward and a big sacrifice, things just don't line up, and there's never been a deck to support this card despite all kinds of intended support from Blizzard with a just bevy of discard synergy cards. It never quite got there, so that's why it's unfortunately so far down on this list. Up next here at the number 7 spot, I have Unite the Murlocs for Shaman, and although this card saw like a tiny bit of play right when it came out, I think for a few days, it looked like it was going to be really good. It fell off fast and never came back. I don't see anyone playing Unite the Murlocs ever. Part of that probably comes down to the fact that there just haven't been a lot of good Murlocs added to the game. Even things like Ghostlight Angler, which allows you to more consistently and easily complete this quest, just didn't get Shaman there. So it's another one where it's a really hard one to activate. 10 Murlocs can happen pretty quickly, but when they do, Megafin's more of like a resource play as opposed to a tempo play. And Murlocs are a tempo deck, so it's almost at odds at itself of the way, like, it's all about reloading, not like cementing or finishing a board lead, so it's not even really that great of a tool. Beyond that, sacrificing a 1-mana play when you're looking to play a hyper-aggressive Murloc deck is a big problem. You need 1-drop, so Unite the Murlocs kind of disrupts your plan from moment number 1. And I think that's a couple reasons why this card has just never taken off. Moving on here, we have the last Kaleidosaur for Paladin, and this is another one that really hasn't seen much play. Frankly, you probably could have argued any of the last 4 cards being in any of these spots, but I have seen people like Kibler, and even myself a little bit, take a card like this and put it into some moderately popular decks. I think Kibler, because of the song in particular, popularized this card more than the other ones on this list, which is why I gave it a little bit of a bump, even though it too hasn't really seen a lot of competitive play. Again, it's just another one where Galvadon, although it can occasionally be a game-winning play, sometimes it just gets dealt with very easily. Casting spells or buffs in Paladin is an okay thing to do, but sometimes it's awkward or slow because you don't have quite enough minions out there. All of that, again, just leads us into a card that lacks consistency and it lacks that oomph that's necessary to really make it a powerful play, and that's why it's never been in a competitive Hearthstone deck. Moving on here at the number 5 spot, we have Jungle Giants, and although this card is still not one that's widely played and considered a great card in Hearthstone these days, it has been played occasionally in some lower tier decks and even in some tournament metas. So for me, this one gets just a little bit of a bump over the previous cards on this list. That's because that discount from Barnabas can allow you to set up some pretty crazy combos, either playing really big minions or doing things like getting a 0-mana Malagos that can open up all kinds of opportunities to 1-turn kill your opponent. And Jungle Giants isn't that hard to activate either, particularly with cards like Cursed Disciple that allow you to get 2 really cheap 5-attack minions in play, particularly with like Oaken Summons. that was a cool combo that made Jungle Giants get off pretty quickly, fairly consistently, that really added to this card's power level. So it's not amazing. Certainly it's not defining the meta in any way, shape, or form, but it has at least been played a little. Moving on to the top 4 now, we have Awaken the Makers for Priest, and this is another one that I wouldn't say has really ever been part of a tier 1 deck necessarily, but particularly in the last 6 months or so, where Priest has gained a little bit of prominence. This card has popped into lists from time to time, just giving everybody some extra depth and some survivability thanks to Amara, because Amara is actually a pretty cool reward. Giving you 40 health and potentially healing you for like up to 39 health. That's kind of ridiculous. And when you combine that with cards like Zola to copy your Amara, that became a really powerful play that gave Priest a ton of survivability and longevity for either control or combo style decks. So Awaken the Makers has popped into some lists from time to time. On top of that, there are a lot of very easy ways for Priest to activate this quest. 7 Death Rattle minions is almost nothing, so they can often get those Amaras off really quickly, and that 5 mana 8/8 with Taunt is a big deal if you're playing it on like turn 6 or 7 against an aggro deck. If you gain 40 health and you shut down their board, that's a game-winning sort of play. So it offers that swing potential that I think is necessary for a card like this. That immediacy goes a long way, and I think that's why Awaken the Makers has seen significantly more play than any of the previous cards on this list. So now let's move into the top 3, starting with Open the Waygate. And this is a card you probably haven't seen a lot lately, but there was a time in Hearthstone where Open the Waygate was a big part of the Hearthstone meta. OTK, Infinite Fireball Priest with Archmage Antonidas and Sorcerer's Apprentices were everywhere on the Hearthstone ladder a while ago, probably a year plus ago at this point. And I think that needs to be recognized. Even if we don't see the card today, this card was a very popular choice. Now, I don't think it was ever a tier 1 deck. Let's be clear. That deck was not the best deck in Hearthstone. It was just a fun deck and a cool way to play for a lot of people. Not to me personally. I hated it, but a lot of people enjoyed it. So it was a very popular deck despite perhaps its sort of middling win rate, which means that Open the Waygate was significant and impactful, particularly in tournament metas. That deck made a lot of sense, so Open the Waygate showed up a lot in sort of tournament style play as well. And because of that, I think it absolutely needs to be recognized as a top 3 card, even more so than Awaken the Makers, which kind of had an opposite path of popularity where it's gotten more popular recently and Open the Waygate's fallen off recently. I still think overall this one was more important to Hearthstone, so that's why it's taken this top 3 spot. So now let's move into the final 2, starting off with Fire Plume's Heart for Warrior. This is a card that has seen a ton of play because both now with cards like Odd Warrior that will sometimes utilize the quest, and just multiple instances throughout the past with Quest Warrior, Taunt Warrior, these sorts of decks, whatever you want to call them, have been popular throughout this card's lifespan and have been tier 1 and tier 2 decks on some occasions. So this has been a really impactful card in Hearthstone, and that's because the 8 damage ping hero power from Ragnaros offers a lot of inevitability to games. You can finish games reliably or just remove a ton of your opponent's big stuff. So because of that threat and that persistent threat that it provides, it's just a great finishing tool and a great asset for Warrior to have, which can otherwise sometimes have difficulty closing out games. And the fact that you're summoning taunt minions often fits right into Warrior's game plan anyway, so they don't even really sacrifice much or lose much on the way to achieving that. And then, of course, the fact that a lot of odd cards line up nicely with Fire Plume's Heart. The Baku era of Hearthstone has contributed nicely to Fire Plume Heart's success as well. To me, what that means is this card is pretty clearly and distinctly above anything we've talked about so far. It's in its own separate tier here, although not number 1 in my mind, still far and away one of the most important and impactful legendary quests. And then let's talk about the card at the number 1 spot, the Caverns Below for Rogue. I went from saying it would be unplayable, and now it takes the top spot, and it's been nerfed twice in between, which is absolutely absurd. But I think because of that, it's really hard to argue against this card as the most dominant legendary quest of them all. Once the Quest Rogue deck rose to prominence, it was super annoying. It was pervasive on the ladder and a very powerful deck at both, a casual level of play, but then even better at a really high level of play in things like the tournament scene or high legend. Quest Rogue was just a ridiculously strong deck. It got nerfed where you had to play 5 minions instead of 4. Turns out that wasn't really enough, and the deck still had a lot of consistency, still created matchup problems. It was a nightmare for control decks to deal with because they would just overwhelm you with all kinds of stuff. And so then we nerf it to 4/4s instead of 5/5s. Turns out that did a lot of work to quell the Quest Rogue success rate, but it's still a deck that's competitive today. If you look at tier list, like it's still kind of hanging on despite all those nerfs. So it's been, incredibly influential in the Hearthstone meta. It's changed all kinds of different Hearthstone eras and what they'd look like because of this deck's power level and the way it influences matchups. Still somewhat relevant today, unlike a lot of these quests. So both because of its history, its absolute impact on the Hearthstone meta, and the fact that it still sits around today as a playable card, that to me is why the Caverns Below is an easy choice for number 1. And there you go. That's my list. The Legendary Quest ranked for one final time here now that they're about to rotate out of standard format. But I'm curious, what do you guys think? Did I get these rankings right? Would you have moved something around? Is there a card you think I overrated or underrated? Would you put Firebloom's Heart ahead of the Caverns Below, for instance? I think there's a small, tiny argument to be made there. I think it's wrong, but I'd happily entertain it. Maybe you can convince me otherwise. All that said, I hope you'll leave all those great thoughts and insights in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.